Reinventing Prosperity. To those who don't know, and I would imagine there's few and far between, Jorgen was one of the authors of the Limits to Growth report in 1972, and in more ways probably than he might ever know, responsible for the views and the work of many of the people who have gathered here today. So I will hand you back now to Camilla to facilitate our discussion on reinventing prosperity. Camilla.
Well, welcome back. And we've got two presentations now after tea. I hope you've had your tea and biscuits and are feeling inspired to listen first to Graeme Maxton, who's the Secretary General of the Club of Rome, amongst many other things. Graeme.
Thank you very much, Camilla. I should maybe just explain to those of you that don't know what the link between the Club of Rome and Limits to Growth is. The Club of Rome was formed in 1968 by an Italian and a Scotsman, Aurelio Pace and Alexander King. And they decided with a group of other people that they wanted to think about the future of humanity, about the long-term prospects for humanity. And in 1968, that was a pretty rare thing to be thinking about when everything seemed to be moving in a very healthy direction. And they were able to work with the Volkswagen Foundation to then commission a group of students at, well, more than students at that time, doctoral, postdoctorate students at MIT to work on a model. It was one of the first computer models to model the outlook for humanity. And Jorgen was part of that team and one of the authors of The Limits to Growth. I'm going to talk about the way we see the world today in the Club of Rome. I'm going to talk less about the way it should be, because we actually think that defining what we need is not that difficult. We need to live in harmony with nature. We need to live in a world where everybody can achieve the most they can and have the best quality of living that they can possibly have. But the really difficult bit, and the bit that the question this book tries to answer, is how do you move from here? How do we begin to move the process towards a more sustainable world? And we think that this is the question that has held everybody up for most of the last 40 years. How do you begin to make that transition? Just briefly, the book, the German version was launched about 6 weeks ago and is now, much to our great pleasure, #1 on Amazon for economics books. It's called 1% is Enough. And in many ways, it's a much better title, because what we're saying with 1% is enough is that if we spend 1% of GDP each year, and we move that investment from dirty technology, so dirty energy production, into clean energy production, then we can solve the problem. It only takes 1% of GDP over 20 years, and we can fix the problem that we face today with climate change. This is the chart that's perhaps the Club of Rome's most famous for from The Limits to Growth. The Limits to Growth is not a book about economic growth. It's a book about what we today call the ecological footprint. And so when we're accused of being anti-growth, that's actually not true. We're not anti-growth at all. We're we're anti-growth in the ecological footprint. The book contains a number of scenarios, some positive, some negative, and it looks at humanity's footprint over a 200-year period, using a number of variables: non-renewable resources, industrial output, food output, population, and pollution. This is what's called the standard run. And you can see what happens is that as a number of these factors increase, industrial output increases, the use of raw materials declines, then eventually around 2030 or 2040, we have a crisis. And the system goes into collapse. Now, when the book was written in 1972 was the black vertical line. And you can see that the anticipation was really very far-sighted in terms of working out the way the world was going to go. And where we are today is the red line. Now, we've gone back every 10 years or so, and we've looked at what's happened. We've looked at each of those factors. And what's happening is exactly as this model shows. Not slightly, but exactly. We're trending exactly up those lines for population, for industrial output, for pollution. And so we're heading to exactly the sort of problem that was anticipated and could have been avoided for those that read Limits to Growth in 1972. So today, we're in a situation which we call overshoot. So the carrying capacity of the planet has got a finite carrying capacity. And because we're degrading that capacity, it's actually becoming lower. But the green line is where we are today. We're living as if we have 1.5 planet Earths. And that's just the average. If you look at the UK, we live as if we have 4 planet Earths. And in the US, we live as if we have 5 planet Earths. And if countries like China or India or much of the rest of the developed world were ever to have the standard of living that we have in Europe today, then we would need 4 planet Earths. It's simply not possible. And so the options are, the trend line is taking us further and further in the wrong direction. The dark red line is limits to growth, collapse. But the green line is how we can move the system back into balance, how we can transition into a more sustainable world so that we can avoid that collapse. And that's what the Club of Rome and the Limits to Growth is about. What are the consequences of us living in this situation? Well, they really fall into 2 categories. There are the environmental consequences and there are the social consequences. Environmentally, by far the most important is climate change. If we carry on producing CO2 at an increasing rate as we are today, and the amount of CO2 we're producing is higher than ever before, then in around 15 to 20 years, we will pass through the threshold which makes 2 degrees inevitable. And if we carry on with the current trend even further, then by around the end of the century, we will make 4 degrees inevitable. Now, just to put that in context, 2 degrees doesn't sound like much when the temperature change between one day and another is more than 2 degrees. But you have to think about 2 degrees a bit like you would think about the human body. We have a very carefully balanced biological system which survives at 37 degrees. If the temperature goes up to 38, that's classed as a fever. And if you go to 39, then your life comes into danger. And it's much like that with the planet. 2 degrees, a 2-degree increase from pre-industrial times will take us back more than 10 million years of ecological history. And if we get to 4 degrees, it'll take us back more than 40 million years when there was no ice on Earth. And it's certainly very unlikely that many of us could survive that. So climate change is by far the most important issue. But there's also species loss, which is accelerating, the pollution of the air, the waterways, soils and oceans, and anthropological destruction. But we also have a number of other problems which we're constantly seeing in the news and which often distract us from the big ecological and environmental problems, and those are the social problems. Greater conflict because of inequality and drought. The Syrian problem is greatly caused by climate change, by people who had to move away from the desert after years of drought and move to the cities, which created conflict within the area of the cities and then created a civil war, which then led to the problems that we have today in migration. So a lot of that is directly related to climate change. Widening gap between rich and poor everywhere, and stubbornly high rates of unemployment. And those are the sort of things that distract us day to day. Why do we have all these problems? Why have we got ourselves into this situation? Now, it's our view that it's the economic system. The economic system that is dominant today, the one neoliberal extreme economic system that started in the early 1980s or the late 1970s when Thatcher and Reagan came to power, are at the root of all of these problems. This current economic system requires us to have continuous growth. We have to increase the amount of production that we have every year. That's why the headlines and the politicians are constantly talking about growth. It's growth in throughput of resources. And as we increase the amount of resources, we have to burn more energy. And as we burn more energy, we create more CO2, and that creates climate change. So because we're pushing hard on the accelerator for economic growth, we're creating climate change. But it's not just that. The economic system is also causing all of the other social and environmental problems too. We're told that growth is needed to create jobs, and it's not actually true, certainly not in the rich world. This is a graph that shows employment and growth in the rich world, in the OECD, from 1990 through to 2005, so 25 years of economic development. And in that period, economic growth was at some of the fastest rates in human history. The red line is economic growth. And you can see it was pretty steady and pretty constant. And the blue dotted line is unemployment. So we had all that growth, and unemployment went up. Now, the reasons for that are fairly complicated. But basically, economic growth is about increasing efficiency. It's about improving productivity. And to increase efficiency, it means you have to drive down costs, which in the long term creates unemployment because you replace people with machines. And so economic growth is not about creating jobs, certainly in the rich world. It's about reducing employment. So it doesn't achieve what the politicians and the economists tell us. The second thing it doesn't do is it doesn't reduce inequality. The famous book that Thomas Piketty wrote a few years ago, Capital in the 21st Century, the basic message of that book is growth increases inequality. There's this myth that there's a trickle-down effect, that through economic growth, the rich will become richer and the money will gradually trickle down into the pockets of the poor. It's not true. This is a rather complicated chart, which you probably can't read, but it's about the Gini coefficient, which is the way economists measure inequality. And basically, when the number is 0, it means everybody's equal and everybody has the same level of wealth. And when it's 100 or 1, it means one person has all the wealth. And in Europe today, the Gini coefficient is about 27 to 32. In North America, it's 48. In sub-Saharan Africa, it's often above 60. The Gini coefficient is higher today than it was in 1914. The level of inequality has risen in the last 100 years. Despite all the economic development and all the economic growth that we are told is good, inequality is higher today than it was in 1914. And if you look in the far right-hand side, which is the gap between the rich world and the poor world, and it goes back to 1820, it's higher today than it was in 1820. So all the industrialization, all the industrial revolution has resulted in a world where the gap between the rich world and the poor world is more than 3 times bigger than it was in 1820. So economic growth does not solve inequality or unemployment. And it doesn't even solve poverty. One of the most quoted statistics from the World Bank and the IMF is that we've lifted 1 billion people out of poverty in the last 30 years. It's not true. The actual numbers make it look that way. Those people living on $1.25 a day, in 1980, 1.9 billion, 2010, 1.2 billion. It looks like there's been a big reduction, and in terms of the percentage of the total population, it's gone down from 42% of the world to 18%. Take out China, and China's a pretty different case because it's followed a very, very clear and state-driven economic success story. Then the percentage of the global population has gone down from 25 to 16. But this $1.25 a day does not account for inflation. The World Bank and the IMF set the limit at $1 a day in 1980. They changed it to $1.25 a day in the late 1990s. But actually, it should be nearer $3 a day. And if you do that, then the number of people living in poverty in the world has gone up to 3.6 billion, more than half the global population. So economic growth doesn't solve poverty either. And if you look at something like free trade, which we're also told is good, that doesn't help a lot of people either. Free trade makes it almost impossible for some developing countries to develop because they can never develop the industrial scale to compete with the developed world. So we have a big problem with our economic system, and it's the cause of our economic problems, and it's the cause of our environmental problems. And we have a mindset problem, as we heard from Rowan Williams. It's a lack of innovation and imagination that we need. We have a rabbit that always wants more carrots. Why do we not do something about this? Why do we not act? Why do we not respond in the face of all these problems? And we think there are 5 main reasons. First of all, the political system. The politicians are stuck in this industrial society logic, in the pockets of big business, maintaining the status quo. They have this vested interest to keep the world as it is. And so governments and politicians are not the answer to our problem. They cannot solve this problem the way things look today. The democratic system is failing us, which is why we have results like Brexit and Donald Trump. It's a cry for help, as I think Oliver said. The second reason is vested interests. We have the 1%. the 1% of the population who have all the money, or certainly half of it, and they have the political power, and they have the levers, and they have the corporate power, and they also are extremely well armed. So they have these vested interests, and they're not going to give that up easily. They also fund a lot of foundations which let us believe that climate change is not real. The third one is short-termism, and this is really what the book is trying to focus, that by nature, people are short-termist. We think about tomorrow and next week, and not about the lives of our grandchildren, even although we say we do. But we actually are focused on the short-termist issues, and we're frightened of change. So there's a natural inertia. We prefer to have something which is certain, even if it's bad, from something which is uncertain, which could be better. The fourth reason is timing. To create the change we need requires us to make the changes or to demand the changes at the right time. And limits to growth was way ahead of its time. In 1972, people were still thinking that they could have growth forever. Today, we're much closer to being in the right time to create the change. We're not there yet, I don't think, but we're certainly much closer. The voices for change are rising in many, many parts of the world. And then finally, cost. The cost of transition, it costs more than doing nothing. And so we don't want to make that investment. In fact, solving the problems with energy don't actually cost that much more, but it costs something, and we don't want to invest in that. Just say, what do we not need? Every time I give a talk, one of the questions that comes up first is, well, surely technology can solve this problem. We need technology. We can invent some sort of system which will solve all these problems. We don't need technology. When it comes to energy, we have all the technology we need to have a low-carbon, sustainable, environmentally balanced system. It just costs a little bit more. So we have to make a decision. It's a political decision to choose to spend a bit more, and we can solve the problem. It is not a problem of technology. And technology will not solve the problems of inequality or unemployment. Those are social, political problems. So we don't need technology. The second thing is we don't need the free market. The free market cannot solve these problems. It cannot be left to the market as we're told by politicians, because this market is the cause of these problems. And as we push harder on the lever, we simply make them worse. One of the other ideas that people often talk about is scaling up grassroots initiatives, the idea that we can go back to nature and live in balance, and we can scale that up. It's something that's popular in the UK, but also in the US and many other countries. And laudable as those ideas are, it's not on a big enough scale. We need to do something much bigger and much more urgently. So, what do we need? We need a transition. We need something which can gradually shift the economic system without knocking it off balance over the next 20 years or so. Clever, non-conventional policy ideas which appeal to the short-termist democratic majority. And that's what the book's about. And now I'm going to hand over to Jorgen so that he can tell you something about those ideas. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I have a different dialect from you, so I need to start speaking about something non-consequential until you start laughing, because otherwise you don't get my wonderful English Norwegian, which is an acquired style which is impossible to unacquire. I also need to start by telling you about my frame of mind, which I think is important in the great collaboration with Graeme about making this book. I have tried to save the world for more than 40 years, actually 45 years. And I have tried this in absolutely all conceivable ways, through education, through corporate social responsibility, through running a business school, through being the Deputy Director General of WWF, the international NGO. And I must admit that I have failed. The world is less sustainable today than it was 45 years ago when I started. And just to see how horrible this feels, because this is feeling, this is not only knowledge. I went to my first discussion of the issues that Rowan so eloquently presented in the summer of 1972, when I participated in the World Council of Churches meeting in Ghana, also because of your relation, discussing exactly the same issues that was raised now. So in 45 years, we have moved exactly nowhere. What to do? Well, this is my 9th attempt at saving the world, joining with Graeme and trying to come up simply with a list of very, 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 very practical, concrete actions that we think that if humanity was kind enough to adopt these, it would actually move the world towards a less sustainable situation than where it is currently going. And instead of giving a very eloquent talk about these matters, treating them at a high level of aggregation, I will simply read out to you the 13 recommendations, because that's all I get the time to do in 20 minutes. If you want, the proper packaging and the deep thoughts, read the book. Here comes, what Graeme and I have concluded after 3 years of hard, soul-searching activity based on my 40 years of trying to save the world. These are the only things we think there is a chance in hell that democracies would actually pass. So we do not list all those good things that ought to happen. We list those things that we think, it would be possible to pass in England or in Norway or in the United States. We doubt it, or I doubt it. Graeme is much more optimistic than I. I've classified our proposals under 4 headings, like here. So that's the reason why the numbering is weird. The numbering follows the numbering in the book. I have sorted them differently. I first talk about those things that will reduce unemployment. I will then talk about those things that will reduce inequity. I will then talk about those things that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And finally, I'll talk about those things we really ought to do in order to create prosperity in the long term, or well-being, which is the word we use. And we will, of course, not get the time to even say more than 1 sentence about each of them, so that's the way it is. So here we go. So the first and most important proposal in the book is to try to reduce unemployment in the rich world. And we do only talk about the rich world in this book, because if you try to combine the problems of the poor world and the rich world, you end up with recommendations that are too complicated for ordinary audiences. So it's much easier to talk about the rich world here, and we can talk about the poor world at another point in time. So the most important thing, we basically say, implement green stimulus packages financed with freshly printed money. In other words, the state should print money and pay it to people and companies in order to clean the world. In other words, when Trump has now been elected, instead of using the money to build new superhighways, etc., he should simply use the money to build solar panels and windmills and electric cars. So, much to our surprise, we have now a president in the United States who might by accident end up, doing our prime thing. The Chinese government is doing this full speed. They're now cleaning the air of China, doing exactly this, employing roughly 7 million people, teaching them how to clean the air and clean the water, and then employing them for the next 7 years. How do you pay for this? You print money. This is the easiest way to distribute the cost among all people in an equitable manner. The second one is to pay workers while they're moving from a closed job in the dirty sector to a new job in the clean sector. The main reason why most people are against active climate policy is, of course, it threatens all the jobs in the coal and the gas and the oil and other dirty sectors, and it takes time before the clean jobs come up. How do you solve? By having ample unemployment benefits that are being paid to people all the time from they start training for the new job until they finally have a job in the clean sector. And this is the way we see it, the only way in which you're going to ever get a democratic majority in favor of a shift of the economy, the 2% or 1% that Graeme spoke about, shifting from dirty to clean production. The third thing, the third on the list is to pay people who takes care of others at home. This is, that's as much an equity issue as it is an unemployment issue, but at least it also has the added benefit of reducing the pressure on the public nursing homes. And then finally, as Graeme already mentioned, restrict trade when this is needed in the rich world to protect jobs. That, in other words, you keep the jobs in the country, even though this costs the owners, my social class, loss of profits. Trade is incredibly important when you're poor and try to get richer. At this point in time in the rich world, we don't need to get richer, we need different distribution of the pie. And this you do by restricting trade. The second slide are issues on how, or recommendations for how to reduce inequality. And the first one on the list is to place a tax on coal, oil and gas at source and redistribute the tax money evenly among all the people in the nation. So you collect in the United States a lot of money from the oil, coal and gas producers, and then you divide it by 300 million people and you send it back to them. This means that those people that use less energy than the average will receive more than compensation for what they use, while the rich people will have to pay very much more. Number two, increase the taxation of corporations and the rich. If you want to redistribute income, you have to take it from the rich. And where are the rich? They are in Norway, and they are among the corporations, and they are owners in general. Three, increase the inheritance tax. There is no reason in the world why children of affluent families should get a lot of money in addition to getting the benefit of growing up rich. The next thing you need to do is to try to help the old by increasing the pension age. This sounds contradictory, and yes, it has to be done in the Norwegian way, where this is voluntary. You just decide whether you want to retire or not. If you retire early, you get slightly less money per year. If you retire late, you get more money per year. But in our day and age, where people do not in general work in the mine, do not generally work in very hard labor, but largely are like you, office people, most of people of my age desperately would like to continue to work, as opposed to what a minority would like to do. And then finally, encourage unionization. What has basically gone wrong in the United States and here and other rich countries is, of course, that the union's strength has weakened to such an extent that much of the value added ends up with my social class instead of ending up in the majority, which is not good if you want to have a society with less inequality. What you do in order to reduce climate gas emissions, again, you do the green stimulus packages. This is the same advice as before. It's just that here we are more explicit about the fact you do this in order to pay for the elimination of the use of coal, oil and gas. In order to save the climate, there is only one thing we need to do, and that is to stop using coal, stop using oil, and stop using gas. And what is then the major beneficial thing you can do through green stimulus packages? It is, of course, to pay people to build the solar panels and to build the windmills and to build the hydropower and the biomass plant. Then again, the same thing. Pay the workers, while they are transitioning from the declining coal industry into the growing windmill industry. And then again, mentioned before, that's why it's parentheses around the numbering, the Jim Hansen tax and distribute system. And finally, green taxes, number 8, shift taxes from income to resource use, which is also one way of getting to working with the market in order to get reduced resource use and increased use of human beings. Finally, the wish list at the end, how do you do anything about well-being in the long run? We think there are 3 things that ought to be done. The first one is to legislate more compulsory vacation. It is basically to shorten the length of the work year. As you will see, we argue that you should introduce 2 new vacation days every year, and you don't do anything with the salary level so that you absorb this through the general productivity increase. It's idiotic to have advanced economies like the United States of America, where people still work 2,000 hours per year, which in our country we did in 1960. We have at least gotten it down now to roughly 1,500 per year, while my friends in the United States still are in the office all the time. In a situation, where you do not really need more wealth, but you need better distribution of the wealth. Number 2 is to introduce a guaranteed livable income for everyone who needs it. Initially, we wanted to push for the general livable guaranteed income for everyone. But when you do the back of the envelope calculations, you see that even rich societies like the United States, England, and Norway can afford this. So you will still have to ration the money for those that fall below the minimum income because of either lack of job, sickness, or age. And then finally, the basic problem of the world is not that we are rich, it's not consumerism, it is the fact that we're too many people compared to the size of the planet. So clearly what needs to be done, or should be done, is to reduce the total population so that each of us could have an even better life. And since, in my experience, there is fierce emotional negative reaction to the proposals of trying to introduce the one-child family in the rich world where it is really needed. My daughter is 30 times as dangerous as an Indian girl. My daughter consumes roughly 30 times as much as the Indian girl. Our proposal here is that we actually put up a financial incentive to having fewer children. So the proposal is that we pay women when they pass 50 years of age, $80,000 if they have had 1 child or less. So in the army of incentives that surround the decision in families on family size, we will add a slight payment in favor of smaller family sizes, and we think this would work tremendously. And yes. So what have we done? We have looked far and near. We have tried to find things that we think would be possible in democratic society. If you look at each of these things, they do provide a short-term benefit to a majority of voters. And here is the list. Why are there not other things on the list? Because in most cases we think these are dreams. We think these are things that will not pass in democratic societies. Luckily, in that category, there are many things that the Chinese Communist Party is doing, and doing very well. For instance, as you know, they are moving very fast on climate gas reductions in ways that would be impossible in England, but which is fully possible when you have an elite management like in China. Thank you very much.